You were one of the few journalists that was actually at the G7 a few weeks ago in Germany, in Bavaria. And then you moved on, didn't you, during the sort of week over into Austria to the Bilderberg Conference. Can you just paint us a little picture of the contrast between the two big international meetings?
Well, certainly. I mean, there were 3,000 journalists in Germany for the G7. In the most extraordinary circumstances, it was that they'd taken over an entire Olympic ice skating rink and built this media centre with workstations and information desks and sort of relaxation rooms, giant relaxation rooms, and buffets and free bars, and it was the most remarkable thing. And they talked about. They talked to me about how they just wanted to make life easy for journalists, and they were providing all this footage that was coming down from the Schloss of the various leaders walking through meadows and drinking their Bavarian pints and what have you. And then, a couple of days later, about 20 miles south of there, crossed over into Austria and just hit a kind of wall of police and some very, very heavy policing, the most heavy I've experienced since 2009 at Bilderberg, and basically everything was done in the government's power to stop journalists doing their job. Not that there were many mainstream journalists there, to be honest, but it was a remarkable contrast, and probably for me the most baffling thing was witnessing the kind of sausage factory of news of the G7, where all the journalists were all kind of had this serious face on as they undertook this important work of basically repackaging this series of press releases that were being given to them, and taking it all extremely seriously, even though the whole thing looked like a kind of cartoon farce. So I found the G7 much more disconcerting, actually, than the heavy policing of Bilderberg.
What sort of reception did you get? Because I understand that you had police actually searching you in the hotel once you'd gone over the border. I mean, it sounds like almost like deliberate harassment.
That was really harassment, yeah. I mean, I found myself with 3 policemen just in my hotel room at about 1 a.m, and they wouldn't go. They were looking at my passport, even though my passport had been looked at by their colleagues, I'd say 5 minutes prior to that and 8 minutes prior to that. I was so checked out. But no, they needed to stand in my hotel room and look at my passport. And they just stood there for so long, and it was so late. I just said, look, I can't wait any longer. I was really annoyed. I just took my shirt and trousers off and walked past them in my underpants and went, I'll go and have a shower. Took a shower, because it was the most aggressive thing I could think of doing, because I was so annoyed. Came out and they said, please put your clothes on, Mr. Skelton, we need to go and check your car. And then I had to go and stand by my car. They checked it. I don't know how they thought I'd got past 2 police checkpoints and done anything of any consequence, but they wanted to do that. And that just made me stand there in a searchlight for about 20 minutes. And that was really, that was harassment. It was definitely harassment. I felt harassed and I felt impeded. And, I don't mind showing my passport around those events a bit. That's sort of okay, although it was done so much that I just couldn't believe they hadn't got an accreditation process. And this is what just really, really annoyed me, that there was no formal accreditation process for the Bilderberg group, considering how much state money was being spent on it. There was military there. There was military, police, huge numbers, helicopters. They even had their kind of special Cobra police. I mean, it was a giant state-run policing operation, but the state couldn't fork out a tiny line in their budget extra, their huge budget, to do some proper press accreditation, which actually would have saved them money, because they would have spent less time checking people's passports. But anyway, that was my particular bugbear, the lack of accreditation.
Yeah, they probably just enjoy doing a bit of harassment. That's part of it, isn't it? I think that the idea is to drive journalists away. Were you the only journalist that covered the G7 and then went to Bilderberg across the border? Did you see anybody else that covered both?
Sorry, say that again. Sorry.
Were you the only journalists that covered both of the conferences?
No, there were a few other. I mean, I don't know whether any mainstream. I'm calling myself a mainstream journalist simply because I was reporting for the Guardian. I'm not exactly a journalist by trade, but there were a couple of there were a few kind of bloggers and citizen journalists who did both and got accredited at the G7. And I think everyone, I spoke to people like Luke Radowski and Dan Dix, I don't know if you heard of them, but so they had a very similar experience of a kind of just a mind melt at the size of the G7, and then then this cold bath of Bilderberg, and it was properly disenchanting to be paid that little respect by that organisation.
Well, look, I mean, I looked at the figures, and the fourth largest contingent behind the bankers, the industrialists and the politicians is the press, the media. There's, I think, 22, even though one of the things I saw said there was 18. Actually, quite a lot of the technical people have also got a big hand in news on the internet and that kind of thing. So certainly the third or fourth largest contingent are the press barons at Bilderberg. Does that bother you? I mean, it bothers me because it does suggest that potentially the journalists are also part of this kind of swearing to secrecy of their bosses as they go in. And of course, the boss of the BBC, Rona Fairhead from HSBC, was in there.
Yeah, and John, and she's got other hats besides that. You've got people like, The Economist. The Economist is very well represented there. So you've got people that are on the board of The Economist, like John Elkann, because the Agnelli lot kind of own a large chunk of it, if not all of it. But so they're a big shareholder of The Economist, and you had the new Economist editor-in-chief there, what was called Zany Meadows, but you had John Micklethwaite, who used to be the editor-in-chief, and now he runs Bloomberg News. So you had the head of Bloomberg News there, John Micklethwaite, but he's also on a senior member of British American Business as well, which is a lobby group, and so he's wearing a number of hats at that conference, and I'm not entirely comfortable, as you say, with how many he's wearing, and there's a lot of kind of a mishmash of business interests, lobbying particularly, and media at Bilderberg, which makes me very uncomfortable. And a lot of very, very senior lobbyists for the big trade agreements like TTIP. Are present at the meeting.
When I covered a couple of these conferences in the early noughties, it was Jim Tucker from American Free Press would go there, which is now rather a nasty magazine, although in those days it was a lot more reasonable. He would chat to waiters, things like that, in the Bilderberg Centre, wherever it was going to be, a few days beforehand, and he would meet up with them in the evenings and get leaks of overheard conversations. Any of that this year?
Yeah, I mean, I got asked to leave the Bilderberg Hotel just after. I decided to just go in, and they had goodie bags this year, so they were handing out their goodie bags. Most people had left, but there were a couple of delegates still there, and I had a chat. Ended up talking to one of the actual steering committee members, or he just resigned from Portugal. You can do a bit of nosing around, and but it kind of feels a little bit grubby. I just prefer them to treat the media with just a bit more respect, and a bit more normally. If you look at
the names there, they do seem to control most of the money in the Western world. Lots and lots of real heavyweight figures in industry and finance. With the media, this is what bothers me, and the politicians almost hanging on their coattails.
Yeah, and the politicians are there. I mean, this year was a very it was very big on politicians. There were 3 European prime ministers there, and the president of Austria was there, and George Osborne was one of 2 finance ministers. The other finance minister, Alexander Stubb, is a member of the the European financial group of financiers, whatever it's called, the Eurogroup. They're going to be deciding Greece's future. So there's a lot of policymakers there with a lot of policies to make, and a lot of lobbyists there who want to influence policies. And I think I don't really care if a bunch of bankers and industrialists want to get together and have a chat. It's the presence of that many very senior policymakers and elected officials that discomforting
yeah,
for me.
And I can see, I mean, certainly my experience is it looks as if, I mean, if you actually can see what's going on inside through photographers, or as we used to do, and you've been doing at the more recent conferences, it's very much the industrialists and the bankers lecturing the politicians, not the other way around. There's definitely a kind of power game going on there.
Well, we saw that. I mean, we witnessed that in action in Copenhagen, so last year, when Sir John Kerr, who's the deputy chairman of Scottish Power, and he holds various other directorships, and he's also on the steering committee at Bilderberg, and he basically lectured George Osborne for about 25 minutes. And when I say lectured him, he just told him what was what. And George Osborne basically listened. And, Sir John Kerr is one of the most senior diplomats of his generation. I think he was the most senior civil servant. He was clearly in charge, and that you just watch the dynamic of them. We took photos of it, and you can see that George Osborne was being schooled. He was being told what was what.
Also,
it was
Charlie,
a very good example of one of those meetings that take place there.
Also, Charlie, the biggest individual single company featured there was Google, with a whole load. Well, I think it was 3 of their executives there. This is interesting to me because Google at the forefront of new technology. It seems that Bilderberg are very interested in that, and also they are thinking, well, this new technology, we want to be in control. And also, there's another side of this, slightly more sinister, which is Peter Thiel and his project to extend life. I mean, it sounds like there's a real interesting high-tech end to it all.
Oh, definitely, and they've really taken them in the last to their bosom in the last 4 or 5 years or less even. They've just moved in, with Mundi from Microsoft and Alex Karp, who is Peter Thiel's sort of protege. He runs Palantir, which is basically a CIA set-up kind of data mining, data analysis company. And Peter Thiel from PayPal is on the steering committee, and and absolutely, the Google played a huge part in it. And Eric Schmidt is everywhere. You need to look up Eric Schmidt and see what boards he's sitting on, and he sits on the board of The Economist, for example. So they're very connected now, and Google's obviously becoming closer to the heart of Bilderberg. And it's very interesting to watch Bilderberg as a group sort of shift into this high-tech arena. And it just shows, when people sometimes, and less and less, Bilderberg is written off as kind of old farts playing golf, because it just self-evidently isn't. But it's even less that these days as they've shifted in to the high-tech arena. And look, absolutely, there's all kinds of interesting aspects. They talked about AI, and I suspect they're looking at AI from the kind of big data,
artificial intelligence,
sort of intelligence and profiling, population profiling kind of way. But there's all sorts of other fringe and not so fringe sort of uses of it. And, like the director of engineering at Google, Ray Kurzweil, is that he's the poster child of the singularity. He keeps going on and on about his desire to merge with machines. I don't think it's wrong to talk about that, because that's on the stated agenda of a few of those people. So, yeah.
Quite a lot of what these people are up to, the bankers particularly, is taking over. Now, I mean, I've drawn the comparison with tanks and an army. In the old days, armies used to kind of charge in and take over. Now, it seems the takeovers are being done as takeover, merger, acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and using cash.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a big... And, let's not forget also the hedge funds and the people like, the private equity groups. And there are huge ones there, like KKR, which has recruited David Petraeus, the ex-CIA boss and criminal, to run their global institute. So they had Henry Kravis there, who's the kind of Gordon Gekko of Wall Street, who runs KKR, and he's there with his right-hand man, Petraeus. So there are people there whose job is to look at the kind of finance of conflict zones and chaos and find out where the big bucks are to be made. And a lot of them have a lot of links through to the CIA. I mean, we saw Kissinger and Petraeus left on the same jet this year, which was an interesting photo. And yes, so and that's always been the way with Bilderberg. It's this kind of slightly messy, fudgy sort of mix-up of Wall Street, the CIA, and other intelligence services. So there was, and the last couple of years, there's been a lot of intelligence services there. People like Sir John Sawyers, who last year was head of MI6, and this year has moved over to his own company, Macro Advisory Partners, because he decided to cash in. He wasn't being paid quite enough as the head of MI6, so he wanted to get his corporate dollar in. So that's what he's doing. And so if you look at the list and just cast your eye down, you can see the presence of the intelligence services. And yeah, absolutely, the hedge funds and the banks. And they're not just sort of small. It's not just like they don't send their representation. It's the very heads of these things go along. Like Lazard and Deutsche Bank and all the others.
It does sound as if...
It was a very highbrow group this year.
Yeah, it sounds to me as if maybe the
high-powered.
Ordinary journalists and politicians, even prime ministers, are a little bit further down the food chain, aren't they?
Yeah, well, it's kind of where... I always think of... people always say, well, what is Bilderberg? And, one of the things it is kind of the interface between the big money and the big, industrial and energy sort of companies and hedge funds and all of that, the people who hold the real power, and the sort of, and some politicians. So it's where they interface. It's, above all of that is other groups and other interests. But this is where you can kind of see the bottom of that thing reach down from the clouds, and you can see the. I'm speaking metaphorically, obviously, but you can sort of see it sort of hoves into view when they have to interface with politicians, and they do it. But so over the course of 3 days, it's not like a lunch or something. It's an extremely regulated set of meetings and seminars.
I mean, I wonder.
We spoke to one guy one of the actual delegates who was there, who runs one of, I think it's Norway's largest public energy company, and he was finding it really hard work. He said, you could tell he didn't want to go back in, and he came in for a chat, and he said, God, he said it's really intense in there, and it's an intense 3 days, or 4 days for some of them, but it's a big deal. It's a large enterprise.
It's a bit disappointed, Charlie. I was a bit disappointed to see your articles don't really appear in the Guardian newspaper. They're only online, which is a great pity. And but one of them was about politicians mingling with criminals. Now, do you actually have any evidence that the people are criminals?
Oh yeah, well some of them got, some of them got criminal records. Like Petraeus has just been given a suspended sentence. I think it was, he's for leaking secrets to his mistress, and then there's René Benko, he's an Austrian. He got given a year-long suspended sentence for bribery, and there's people actually in there with criminal records. I mean, never mind the people practically everyone in there has had to resign in disgrace at some point from public office, or well, not everyone, but there's a good few, and there's Kissinger's. I think he might have some kind of questions being asked about war crimes in various countries.
Well, I can tell you, I mean, there are several countries where Henry Kissinger, if he steps off a plane, will be instantly arrested, and that's for sure. Anyway, we're still. Kevin's been very, very patient from Avon Somerset Police Federation here. Kevin, how can we be in a situation where police, paid for by the public, are guarding a conference like this, where, as you just heard from Charlie, there are criminals inside, people maybe who've had suspended sentences, that sort of thing, and particularly we've got HSBC sitting in there. These are people who've been fined, I think it was $2 billion for money laundering in the United States, and yet they've got off scot-free. Aren't the police facing the wrong way?
I think it's probably been said already, but the industrialists and the bankers, they run the politicians. The politicians run the media. The politicians also run the police service. At the end of the day, you've got, if you look at this country, you've got the Home Office and Theresa May running the police service. So we're still accountable to them, and I guess it's just which way you follow the chain upwards, isn't it?
I know at the Police Federation Conference you were given a bit of a ticking off by Theresa May, weren't you?
It's about what I expected at the police conference. We've gone through an election. you reap what you sow, don't you? And the voters have gone out there. They've voted this government back into power. The police service expects to get the kicking that we got as per usual, and I don't think anything's going to change. I think Theresa May will continue to have a go at the police service. We know that she's got another 5 years to play with us, and it's just a bit like a kitten with a mouse, isn't it?
Also, Charlie, it's well worth mentioning it was a very different style of policing here in Britain at Watford 2 years ago when Bilderberg were here, wasn't there?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that was quite. It was heartwarming to see the not just the mainstream media who turned out in droves, but we had 2,000 people in a field with another 2,000 being turned away, and those are the police numbers. So that's 4,000 people turned up, which is definitely unprecedented in the history of Bilderberg watching. Numbers have quietened down a bit since then, but it's the perceptions and the rhetoric in the mainstream media is definitely changing for the better, and it's being taken much more seriously. And it's been taken seriously finally by things like the BBC. They did a dreadful piece on the Sunday politics, but actually online they did quite a good crunch of the numbers, and quite a few of the newspapers did fairly straightforward kind of analyses of the list, which we haven't had really before. So that was all to the positive. So things are changing. Maybe we haven't got 4,000 people, but there was a kind of a protest march in the town of Telf, which had about 500 people there. So 500 is not bad, and did get some coverage, and quite a lot of coverage in the Austrian press. Yeah, but maybe the British press didn't actually bother to send anyone particularly there, but they still. The rhetoric is changing for the better, and finally it's being taken a bit more seriously, because when you look at it, it's being taken seriously by everyone there and by the police outside, incredibly seriously. They shut down the airspace. They had a military radar station there, a couple. That's how seriously they're taking it. So it's fine. It's good when the media finally kind of digs down and realises, yes, okay, there's a thing we can actually talk about in serious terms.
Old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers, I've been talking a couple of times here about industrial feudalism. I mean, what with the royalty as well, it doesn't take a lot of a leap of imagination to see this as a kind of Sheriff of Nottingham-style feudal days where actually they're completely invulnerable, as a king would be. No one's going to elect a king.
Well, Charlie will remember the speech I made at Bilderberg, the protest at Bilderberg in Watford, where in actual fact the police were very supportive of our protest. It depends where you are. In Catalonia the police were also very friendly to the protesters. Austria, obviously there's something going on there. But one of the speeches I made at Bilderberg, I pointed out that Fernando Imposimato, who is the head of the Italian Supreme Court, the senior judge in Italy, who had published a book which came out in 2012, called La Repubblica dei Strani Impuni, the Republic of the Unpunished Massacres, basically saying that the intelligence services, and NATO intelligence services in particular, were responsible for terrorist activity in Italy of the 70s and the 80s, and he was the investigating magistrate on many of these incidents, the Bologna bombing, etc. And he spoke in Corriere della Sera the week before the Bilderberg Conference in Watford, saying, well, we think Bilderberg are the terrorists. He's the head of the Italian judiciary. And, of course, you're not going to read about that in the Daily Mail, are you?
Charlie, I wonder if you think that there's, from your point of view, if you think that there's a connection between the Bilderbergers and a lot of the sort of conflict that we've seen in the world. Because, certainly one of the things I would say is you've got to look at some of the arms firms, the EADS and representatives from BAE Systems that go to these meetings. They seem to be quite wedded in with the ideology of expansionism, of NATO moving east into Eastern Europe up to the Russian border, and they're also quite interested in expanding and getting energy resources from the Middle East. What are your thoughts on that angle to the Bilderberg, and because they're very connected up with the NATO countries and that sort of expansionist attitude?
Well, we've had the head of NATO at Bilderberg. I say we. The head of NATO has gone to the Bilderberg conferences for the last 2 years, and in Copenhagen they had the head of the Allied Supreme Command.
Just to interrupt you, sorry, but I was looking at some research which said actually every head of NATO since the 1970s has been to a Bilderberg conference before they've become the head of NATO. So it seems like there's a way of introducing the person who's about to be made the head of NATO to some of the politicians and that kind of thing. But anyway, it does look as if this is part of a kind of expansionist empire. And I suppose I go back to saying, is this really a feud, something feudal about all this? Yeah,
and you're absolutely right about EADS as well. They're a big presence, and as I said, the CIA as well. So you've also got them. If you look at the agenda, you've got them talking about Russia and the Ukraine and that kind of thing, and they bring in their experts to do their talks and their seminars, what have you, and thrash out their policies. So. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to be specific about tying in the policies and with what little information we at this stage know. But certainly, you've got the presence of arms companies and foreign ministers and things like that discussing an agenda which is white hot when it comes to things like Russia and Ukraine. So yeah, absolutely, it's definitely on their kind of discussion table, and it's hard to extrapolate a little more than that, and I'd be unwilling to myself. But
okay, fine.
Absolutely.
But do you think they've got an Achilles heel, these people?
I think one of the Achilles heels that it has, if you're allowed to have more than one, is the pressure being put by the alternative media, and it's just there's so many more cameras and blogs and Instagram pictures and YouTube channels being pointed at this meeting, and so much more kind of peripheral alternative. I mean, I say peripheral, but it's becoming more of the most important area of debate, or rather the place where the debate happens, in the alternative media. So I would say that that's one thing they find quite hard, I think, to control. And, young people are interested in it as a subject, and everyone's making their little films and their movies and putting it out, and it's getting watched and talked about. And so I would say that the way that and all my pieces are, 90% of them are just on the Guardian website, but that has huge reach, and it's pinged out to everyone that's got a laptop and an internet connection. They can have a look at it. So I think that's a weakness of their slightly old school, Cold War desire to draw the shutters and have their meeting behind closed doors. Those closed doors kind of are a bit leaky at the moment, and it looks a bit silly when they're hiding behind newspapers and tinted windows as they zoom in. That all does smack of the 1950s and 60s, and I don't think they're really managing to play that card anymore. I hope.
I mean, the main mission of Bilderberg, as far as I can read it, from its inception with the CIA funding in the 1950s and Prince Bernhard the Nazi chairing it for the first 20 years, has been to drive a wedge between Western Europe and Russia. Do you think they're going to succeed in that aim?
Absolutely, yeah.
Are they going to succeed in their aim to do that, do you think?
If you look at the kind of the Russian experts and the people they have, they're very sympathetic towards, a Western take on things. But that certainly seems to be one of the reasons why the whole thing exists at all, is as a kind of intelligence service-run bloc sitting over against the East. And I don't think that's changed very much at all. But, you have people there that they're much more open towards China. People like Kissinger are very China-philic, whatever the right word would be. It's a terrible mishmash. But Russia, I don't think, is their favourite country.
But, I mean, I'm asking, I'm going to really press you on this, Charlie. What's your instinct? Do you think that they're, in the next few years, are they going to succeed in driving that wedge? Because, I mean, obviously, we're in a difficult situation financially. Both Russia and Europe are interdependent for trade. But it seems that the Bilderberg and that influence is trying to stop that. Are they going to succeed to stop it?
Well, I don't know. I do know that I'm sure Russia gets a kick out of the fact that Russia Today is probably one of the biggest broadcasters that covers Bilderberg. And, they do a really good job of it, by the way. Russia Today, they're amazing in some of the things they do. And the fact that they turn out, they make good reports and balanced reports about the Bilderberg Group is it must infuriate the steering committee. But so I don't know whether they'll succeed. I mean, who knows whether they'll succeed in doing it? They're just they're one extremely powerful group. There are many, and there are many with a very similar desire to keep Russia isolated and to keep turning the ratchet. So yeah, I don't know. Who knows? I haven't got a crystal ball.
Okay, all right, Charlie Skelton. Anyway, thanks very much for your BilderBlog, and thanks very much for managing to get through on the phone to us here on the Politics Show.
Thank you.
Made in Bristol.